Nicholas Woolley, and I am the British High Commissioner accredited to Zambia. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be asked to chair this next session on regional environmental priorities. I do so and in my capacity as my country's representative here, who, as the United Kingdom, represents the President of the Conference of Parties of the UN climate change process, COP26, which was hosted in Glasgow a few months ago. And our presidency runs through to November, when COP27 will be held for the first time here on the continent of Africa in Egypt. Just a couple of housekeeping points to mention. We have a number of people here in Lusaka in person, but it's also a hybrid event. So I believe a majority of people are joining us online. Can I remind everyone that this session will be on the record and in fact is being streamed live on the Chatham House Facebook page. It's designed to be participatory. So please do come step forward with any questions that you have, either those in the room or online, and we'll ensure that once the guest speaker has given his remarks, there'll be an opportunity for some questions, and also you can use the chat box for those of you online as well. So please do feel free to contribute to this debate. As I mentioned, this is on regional environmental priorities, and the 2021 COP26 summit of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which was held in Glasgow in the United Kingdom last year, was by many measures a great success in terms of what the negotiators from all of the UN state parties agreed at that conference. Just to recap some of those agreements, first of all, they agreed to keep alive the aim to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, with specific mention of the role of fossil fuels in climate change for the first time at a COP, in a COP document. Delegates agreed to call to at least double adaptation finance by 2025. They agreed progress on Article 6 of carbon markets and agreements on halting and reversing deforestation. And also on new commitments to assist a just transition away from coal. Zambia played a key role as part of these discussions and negotiations at COP26. They signed a number of pledges, including on halting and reversing deforestation by 2030 and committing to a clean energy transition. President Hichilema himself attended COP26, fresh after his election here in August, and indeed spoke at the event. And just to highlight one of those remarks that President Hichilema made to the conference, he noted that we only have a small window of opportunity to ensure that we collectively take decisive action and prevent the negative impact of climate change. Note the word collectively. Climate change is a complex problem that requires cooperation and collaboration among nations. No one alone can solve the issue. So as we move towards COP27, there's no other way to address those challenges than working together and building on the successes of COP26. There's still a lot more we can do, which is why it is so fantastic to have this session today and to have the pleasure and honor of introducing Mr. Ephraim Shitima, who is here with us today. Mr. Shitima, who many of you will be familiar with, is the Zambian Director of Climate Change and is also now the chair of the African Group of Negotiators. So we're working to formulate a united African position on key negotiating points to ensure that COP27, the African COP, achieves objectives for lasting and deep positive change for the economies, people, and environments of this continent. So without much further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker and invite Mr. Shitima to address the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your kind words and introductions. And probably before I start speaking, let me just convey our gratitude to the hospitality that we enjoyed in the beautiful city of Glasgow during COP26. We think that that was well arranged, and we need to remind ourselves that this was done in the context of COVID-19 when it was almost at its highest. But the measures that were put in place were excellent, and it ensured that the proceedings went well. And I think the outcome from Glasgow speak for themselves. So I just wanted to extend that. And if I may adopt your protocols, Your Excellency, I just want to recognize all the dignitaries, the excellencies, the ambassadors who are here, and all invited guests, and also just to appreciate being invited to speak at this forum. Like His Excellency, the High Commissioner indicated, I'll be speaking in my capacity as chair for the African Group of Negotiators. And I know that the topic is on the priorities, environmental priorities for the region. And as you may understand, that's quite a complex subject because Africa itself, having 54 countries, is a complex region. We have different regional priorities in terms of both the geography and the social situations are not the same. And so if you are to talk about environmental priorities, you'll have to look at the broad spectrum of the issues. But I think it is important probably to indicate that climate change probably is an underlying denominator now in terms of all the challenges that we have as a continent. Whether you're looking at air pollution or water pollution or diversity degradation, or indeed the depletion of wildlife in other parts of the continent. The bottom line that comes to your mind when you analyze most of these issues, the impact of climate change is exacerbating most of these challenges that Africa faces. And so the priorities inevitably have to hinge on how you address climate change as a continent. And so I'll speak from that perspective. Of course, addressing climate change, like we all know, requires that we deal with the root cause of the problem, which is addressing the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming and ultimately climate change. If you take Africa in that context, of course, the situation is such that the contribution from Africa has been quite minimal, both historically and at the moment. I think around 5% of the global emissions come from Africa. But that doesn't mean that we sit on our laurels, because the growth of these emissions across the continent and in a number of sectors are high. That is where the issue is. The growth of the emissions in most of the developing countries, including Africa, are high. What that means is that we need to address that so that we pursue low carbon development pathways and reduce the increase in the emissions. So that's one. The second part is, of course, adaptation. African countries are already impacted by climate change. Most of our fragile sectors, if you're looking at this agricultural sector, for example, irrigation levels in Africa are quite low. So we have a high dependency on rain-fed agriculture. And what that means, any changes in the rainfall pattern, whether you receive too much of the rains or too little of the rains, means that the agricultural sector is impacted. And so building resilience in the agricultural sector is key to ensure food security. When you look at the water itself, I think climate change, most experts refer to it as water change, because I think water is at the battlefront of climate change in terms of addressing it. And water is quite an issue in Africa, whether you're looking at the Sahel region or even the sub-Saharan region itself. We do have challenges of water. And so adaptation and building resilience, ensuring that we can have access to clean drinking water across the continent is key. I think broadly you can run through all the sectors. You would find that adaptation or responding to this challenge of climate change and ensuring that sustainable development can proceed while addressing this is quite important. And so from our context, Your Excellency, we very much appreciated the success that was made on adaptation, in particular, adopting and operationalizing the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Global Goal on Adaptation, the 2-year work program that was adopted, which has ensured that countries will now have to work for the next 2 years to see how we can operationalize that global goal on adaptation. This was an important outcome because it is driving us to have a balance between mitigation and adaptation. As the saying goes, what you can't measure, you can't manage. We are able to calculate in terms of emissions on the mitigation part, and that's why it is very easy to be able to assess, because you can calculate the tons of carbon when you're addressing mitigation, which is why it is even easy to mobilize the support, I think, in terms of addressing mitigation. It has been shown that a lot of resources, global finances are flowing more to mitigation. Of course, there have been efforts to see how that can be balanced up with adaptation. But the challenge is, how do we ensure that you can indicate and track progress in how you are building resilience, for example, in the sectors that I talked about? And that's where the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal and adaptation is important. It is taking us to operationalize Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, which establishes the global goal and adaptation. Ultimately, we should have some indicators, whether these are qualitative or quantitative, but they are measures that will help you show how we are moving in building resilience. And I should indicate that Zambia is a pioneer in this, Your Excellency. The revised NDC that we submitted in July 2021, actually on 30th July 2021, is one of the few NDCs, if you go to the website, which has an annex at the end where we tried to indicate to show the indicators that we have developed. Of course, so far they are only qualitative, but we think that is an important starting point because we are able now to start tracking progress. How are we enhancing resilience in the sectors, both in the biophysical and even the human systems? So that outcome, in our view, is very important. But of course, we think that it should be coupled now with adequate means of implementation in how we move forward in operationalizing that. The other key priority that I can talk about in terms of the African context, and this is linked to raising the ambition, because I think in Glasgow, we all agreed that the aggregate efforts globally in addressing climate change falls short to put us on a track that is safer. We cannot attain the 2 degrees Celsius that we've been targeting, that we ensure that global warming doesn't go beyond 2 degrees, let alone the 1.5 degrees, which for most developing countries, the most vulnerable, is the safest bet that we have. But to ensure that we can raise the ambition, putting in place mechanisms like the market mechanisms are important, because that is one channel that we need to bring in the private sector into addressing climate change. And so Article 6 and the outcomes on the mechanisms that will help the carbon market thrive after Glasgow was also an important, and we think for Africa, it's an important priority. But then we also know, at least those who follow, that Africa didn't fare very well in the carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol, particularly the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanisms. Basically, the continent wasn't fully prepared to participate fully in that one. And our hope is that we ensure the continent is adequately prepared. This means that apart from just unpacking what the rules that were adopted entail for the private sector, for example, and the financial institutions, it would also require some capacity building and ensuring that Africa is among the front runners once the carbon market under Article 6 is up and running. I think in the interest of the Chatham House rules, I know that I'm not supposed to dominate the discussion, Your Excellency, but those few points that I've highlighted would be key to stimulate the discussion, and I'll be ready to respond to some of the comments and questions. Once again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shitima, for those remarks, which covered quite a broad spectrum of the issues that are live now and will be live going forward to COP27. The opportunity now is for those either in the room to please raise their hands if you have questions or remarks that you'd like to make, or if you are watching and participating online, please virtually raise your hand and I'll be able to have your question fielded by one of the organizers of the conference. Yes, we have a point here in the front row. Please go ahead. The microphone's coming your way.
Good afternoon. Mr. Shitima, I just wanted to get...
Sorry, can I just ask everyone who's making a point just to introduce themselves very briefly?
Thank you. My name's Brenda Chanda, and my question is directed to Mr. Shitima. I just wanted to find out generally how African countries, and maybe specifically Zambia, are balancing the demands that are being made by the international community for adaptation measures, and also how these measures may affect the livelihoods of Africans, and what governments are doing to cushion communities that depend on, for instance, charcoal burning. For some people, that's a business, it's a livelihood. So to take away that, when you take away that, what is being given back to them? Thank you.
Thanks. I think what we'll try and do is take 2 or 3 questions, remarks in a group, and then allow Mr. Shitima to reply collectively to them. So we've got another question towards the back of the room. Again, if you could just introduce yourself and say where you're from, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mansa. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Mwansa from Woolley University. And ask a question around within the framework of the
Sorry, could you just speak a bit more directly into the mic? We're having trouble hearing you at the front. Thank you.
Okay. Is this okay? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So my question is within the framework of Africa's industrialization. So if you look at drives like the African Free Continental Trade Area, this is obviously premised on the back of a huge industrialization push, right? And Africa has a lot of natural resources, some of which are oil, coal, right? So in order to industrialize, there's going to be this need to use this so-called dirty energy. So don't you think there's some sort of paradox between Africa correcting its industrialization deficit and also this push for climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation? Thank you.
Thank you. Another good question. And we've got one final one in this round over to our left. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian from Zambia. Find out from you, Mr. Shitima.
We have the mic volume just put up a little bit so that we can hear the gentleman address this question.
Okay. I just wanted to find out.
We're going to get you a new microphone.
Yeah, I just wanted to find out whether as a country we do have policy. I heard you mention that Zambia signed a protocol of sorts in Glasgow regarding coal. And I'm just imagining with all the ambition around the investments that are coming up, I don't know whether, for example, the public would agree that we shut down the Mamba coal mine and also the power plant. And also we've seen in the region, for example, Uganda just signed a $10 billion investment deal for their petroleum. Who knows, maybe in the near future, Zambia could make discoveries in the basins up north and also the western side where we had Namibia making discoveries. we have an energy transition policy? If not, are there any plans so that we have a soft landing in this sector?
Thank you. We'll just ask Mr. Shitima to come back on those three questions before taking others. So, Mr. Shitima, a point there around adaptation, one around industrialization, and then one linked to that second one around the use of coal. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I hope I'm audible at the back. Thank you very much. I think the questions both from Brenda and Mwansa are quite similar, although I didn't get the last one very well. And I'll start from the convention. Right from the convention, in terms of the objective, you'll find that it recognizes the issue of development and also particularly ensuring that poverty is reduced. So whatever we are doing in addressing climate change has to be done in the context of sustainable development. And most of the decisions up to even the Paris Agreement does recognize even Africa's special needs and special circumstances. And so even when decisions are being made and negotiations, we emphasize on the fact that poverty reduction, for example, sustainable development are overriding priorities for Africa, because we cannot address climate change if we abandon sustainable development. But then the context in which we are, in terms of development paradigm itself, it's shifting. The issue of coal and other fossil fuels, the decision was a very delicate balance that had to be struck. If you read that decision, it talks about phasing down. It gives you that, it recognizes that in a number of countries, this will have to be transitional. And you are talking about just transitions, in fact, in plural, just transitions. So there is a recognition that countries are at different trajectories of their development. And so in terms of how they move to green energies and other green production systems, it will not be at the same time. There will be gradual, there are things that have to be put in place for countries to be able to transition without disrupting their production processes. But the bottom line is that the future that we are going through requires that we develop at a different trajectory through a low carbon development. And evidence is showing that you do much better through development, through the low carbon development pathway than you would with the traditional approach. I think if you just take a simple example of our own economic context, if you take agriculture, for example, and I'll come back to that because it's an important aspect for us. There have been studies that show how productivity improves with conservation farming and other climate smart technologies, even in the context of climate change. So some of the measures, most of the measures, in fact, that countries are taking are both in their self-interest and not just for global interest in terms of addressing climate change, but also just to emphasize that in terms of adaptation measures, even most of the mitigation measures, there are a lot of core benefits which actually accrue to the country and not just for the global public or the global community. If you take, looking at our water bodies, for example, if we say we need to undertake measures such as conserving our forests to ensure that rivers continue flowing, the benefits that will arise from that are mostly local and to the countries. But what that does is you also address your carbon footprint as a country. And so you're addressing both domestic development priorities, but also contributing to the larger global efforts in addressing. So probably it's a perspective that we need to change. This is not something that is driven from outside to say Africa needs to make this contribution. And so it's at the detriment of our development. No, it is also in our best interest, but admitted poverty reduction, sustainable development, many key priorities that are factored in any decisions that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shitima. It's only a short session, unfortunately. So we will take, I think, just one final round of questions, either from those in the room or those online. And we had two hands up towards the back. Any advance on two? Or perhaps let someone online if they have points to make as well. It's the final one.
My name is Blessing Mataka from Mulungushi University. On the subject of climate change, I think much of the discussion centers around the threats or the threats that climate change is posing on human life. But can we possibly also not look at it from a positive perspective in terms of maybe the opportunities that we can actually derive from this phenomenon and possibly be proactive in addressing some of the issues? Maybe one of the major threats today maybe is the aspect of drought, and maybe commonly now, maybe because of too much rain or inconsistent patterns. But what are we doing possibly? Are we harvesting the water, or the water is just coming and just flowing away without looking to tap into the opportunities that this phenomenon is posing from a positive perspective? Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have a further question to the left.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Akufuna Muyonda from Common Futures Conversation and the Resilient 40 Africa, a youth network that is, of course, inspired by the UK government under FCDO. I'm particularly interested in finding out from the user. I know very well of the good work you're doing also under the ministry, but also as an individual. My greatest concern has been access to information, especially when in as far as research and development is concerned in regards to climate change. We can talk about adaptation, we can talk about building resiliency, but if we have no information to work with, we have no data to work with, it's a very big challenge. I'd like to find out to what extent, as you convene as African Group of Negotiators, is this issue being considered, and what kind of support is required to actualize this, especially at the local level in Zambia, but also in every other African country. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. Do we have any further questions? I'll just see if we have any online as well. Ross? There's one question online.
Thank you. So this is on behalf of Zenge Simakoloi, who's asking, to what extent can Zambia maximize on value addition in copper given onset of EV industries and diversify at the same time? France and the UK have carbon emission-free targets in which EV cars are at the center. How can Zambia keep track on economic diversification whilst participating in the EV industry, which is reliant on copper and cobalt?
Thank you. Okay, so we had first question around positive perspectives, second question around access to information, and then that third final one on electric vehicles and economic diversification. Mr. Shitima, I'll let you take them all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think I'll combine the first and the second, the one by Blessings and Zenge, Malloy, because I think the opportunities, like you indicated, indeed, it's not doom and gloom on climate change. Of course, we wouldn't say it's something that we would have wished upon ourselves, but the transition that is happening, for example, provides opportunities that we can take advantage of and move forward. For example, the transition to electric vehicles that India has talked about, it almost puts us on the same footing with the developed countries, the industrialized countries, because everyone is moving in that area, meaning that we can take advantage and make that as a niche as developing countries, and probably take advantage of that and be some of the manufacturers of these vehicles. I know when he was referring to copper, coal, and others, some of the minerals that are required, for example, to produce batteries for these electric vehicles are found in developing countries, including Zambia. So those are opportunities as this transition is happening to move away from the fossil fuels going to electric vehicles. We should position ourselves to see what is it that we're going to be contributing. And so those are some of the areas that we take up as opportunities. In terms of access to information, Akufuna, yes, this is critical. Access to information on climate change is very important. Now, not only access, because I'm sure when we talk of access, it may just be referring to, do we have access to government policy documents? Do we have access? But actually, we should start from simplifying the complexity of climate change itself and make it accessible to the ordinary person in the community who should respond to that. So even before we come to talk about access, the issue is, can we simplify this complex subject? Can we even translate these into languages that our common people on the ground who should be making their livelihood decisions can have and access to that? And that is what is critical. We've had attempts on that, but I must admit there's a lot of work that requires to be done to do that. But the efforts that we've taken, including if you are watching, particularly in the Zambian context, popular TV programs in local languages, you see scrolling messages on climate change as translations just to sensitize the public. But in terms of access, and particularly now for social media, because this is what is trending, anything that you do, government is moving into e-governance, and you've seen a lot of accessibility in terms of information. I can indicate, for example, that the department was authorized to have a Facebook page. We do have a Facebook page as Climate Change Department where we feature most of the issues that we do. And this is making it to have the feedback quite quickly from the public, particularly our youthful generation. They are very quick to respond and make comments on what we do. But for documentation, usually most government departments, including ours, upload most of the documents online. But of course, there are improvements that we need. But access to information on climate change, if people are going to change their behavior and contribute to the effort, is quite key.
Thank you. I can see that the chat bar online has got a number of messages coming in. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I think it's been a very rich discussion. And this slot after lunch is often a tough one, but Mr. Shitima, you've given some very poignant remarks, food for us all to think about, and in a very engaging way answered and addressed many of the questions that you've been asked during this session. It's very clear that climate change is an issue that increasingly matters to all of us here in Zambia, more broadly across the globe. We are already feeling the devastating effects of climate change. And so the importance of working together is going to be paramount if we're going to address and tackle, mitigate and adapt to the challenges ahead. So it's in that vein that I'm proud that the UK as current COP president is working closely with Zambia and with others across the international spectrum in order to ensure that the successes that were achieved in Glasgow continue moving forward, and that we drive that momentum through to COP27 and beyond here in Africa, in Sharm el-Sheikh later this year. So it just leaves me with a final warm and appreciative thanks to Mr. Shitima for coming and speaking to us this afternoon, and to all participants as well for being engaged in a very rich, thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Your Excellency, it was a pleasure.